This presentation is about behaviorism with a focus on operant conditioning. We will the historical evolution and authorship of behaviorism, the basic elements of behaviorism, the strengths and limitations, as well as the applicability to current educational environments. Behaviorism developed over the course of approximately 50 years. There were three men who were instrumental in the development of behaviorism: Pavlov, Thorndike, and Skinner. Pavlov began his scientific career as a physiologist, first researching animal digestion and then researching salivary production. The basis of his behavioral research was physiological, that is, the animal's response was involuntary. In the early 1900s, he discovered that a dog will salivate when a person presents it with food. He then tried ringing a bell, or neutral stimulus, prior to presenting the dog with food, which is also called the unconditioned stimulus. Over time, the dog started to salivate when the bell rang, which is now the conditioned stimulus. And you can see in the image that the dog is presented with food, salivates, presented with the whistle, no response. Then whistle plus the food, there's an unconditioned response. And then after conditioning, presented with the whistle, there's a conditioned response. In the 1910s, Thorndike studied the trial and error learning behavior of animals who were trying to get food or escape a box. He came up with a theory of law of effect and trial and error learning. He found that the animals made associations between their experiences and the outcomes of those experiences. The animals chose the most successful experience to achieve their goals when tested in further trials. And you can see on this graph that initially it took a bit of time to get out of the box. The cat is in the box. And then there was one trial where there was a lot of time when the cat was really learning. And then after that, the cat took pretty much the same amount of time because the cat would just repeat the successful behavior. And that was called connectionism. In the 1930s, Skinner expanded on Pavlov's and Thorndike's works. He researched the voluntary aspects of learning. Operant conditioning describes the use of reinforcements to increase the likelihood that a behavior will occur. As you can see in this image, the rat has learned to push the lever when the light signals in order to have food dispenses. So while the dog, the Pavlovian dog, had an involuntary response, and Pavlov studied the involuntary response, Skinner was more interested in voluntary efforts to gain the reinforcement. Next, we will talk about the key elements of behaviorism, operant conditioning. Behaviorism makes an assumption, and the major assumption is that behavior is solely a response to the environment. It's not a result of genetics, biology, free will, or emotions. Another key element of behaviorism is reinforcement. The three-term contingency refers to the provision of a stimulus or antecedent, followed by a behavior, which leads to a consequence or reward. Positive reinforcement is a reward or stimulus that increases the chance for behavior repetition, and it's the antecedent in the three-term contingency. Negative reinforcement is the removal of stimulus that increases the chance for behavior repetition. So in the case of the rat in the box, the positive reinforcement is the food. The antecedent is the light. And then the consequence is receiving the antecedent is the light, the behavior is pushing the lever, and the consequent is the positive reinforcement. Extinction is the decrease in behavioral response due to a lack of reinforcement. In operant conditioning, the behavior can be lost if reinforcement is not consistently applied. This is likely because there is no internal motivation for the behavior according to the theory of operant conditioning. The behavior is shaped by the environment. Primary reinforcers or rewards are those that are necessary for survival, such as food. Secondary reinforcers or rewards are those that are associated with primary reinforcers. They are not necessary for survival and may be of no use to the animal or person, for example, a bell. The Premack principle states that an animal or person will perform a less desirable activity, for example, cleaning, in order to be able to perform a more desirable activity, for example, playing on the playground. And the Premack principle is especially useful in with parenting, in the classroom. So if you do A, which is not so great, then you'll get to do B. So we'll read first. You'll get to go out to the playground if you read first. Punishment is the provision of negative reinforcers, for example, pain, or removal of a positive reinforcer. There are also different schedules of reinforcement, such as continuous, intermittent, fixed interval, and variable interval. With a continuous schedule, every desirable behavior is reinforced. With an intermittent schedule, only some of the desirable behaviors are reinforced, and this typically occurs when you're in a group setting and the person in charge cannot does not notice all desirable behaviors. With a fixed interval schedule, time is the determinant for reinforcement frequency, and the schedule is predetermined and stays the same. With a variable interval schedule, the schedule could change. The strengths and limitations of behaviorism. The strengths of behaviorism are that it considers the environmental influence, and it's easily researched. The behavior is quantifiable, the reinforcements are quantifiable. It's very easy to associate cause and effect. It's easy to control these variables when doing research, and it can be very straightforward. The results could be very positive and quick to come about. The problems with behaviorism is that it is superficial and simplified. It does not consider free will, cognitive or emotional processes. It doesn't take into account biological and genetic influences. So there might be some other factors that are affecting, for example, a child's behavior, and if you just change the behavior, you're not changing underlying issues that the child may have or the adult may have, and you might get the behavior that you would like, but the child or adult may not feel happy with this change, and it may not have long-term effects on learning. Behaviorism, despite its limitations, is very applicable to current education environments. One example is applied behavioral analysis, or ABA. It's used in classrooms and homes to improve functional, verbal, academic, and social skills in individuals with autism spectrum disorder. A trained behavioral analyst conducts an assessment of the individual and develops goals and a treatment plan. The treatment plan includes the types of positive reinforcers that the analyst will use, for example, food or verbal encouragement. And these reinforcers are dependent on the individual's preferences. For example, a child who loves trains will have a reinforcer of being able to play with a train. Negative reinforcement for unwanted behaviors is used, and it consists of removal of positive reinforcement. In the past, punishment was used, for example, a mild electric shock, but that is no longer considered an approved practice. There's a lot of research to support ABA. It's covered under insurance. Most insurance covers ABA. In a recent research study, McPhellamy and Dillenberger reported that parents in Europe found that their children had improved social and verbal skills, fine and gross motor skills, concentration, functional independence, and quality of life after participating in ABA. The researchers interviewed 15 families whose children received ABA therapy. These results are supported by a meta-analysis of 11 studies of children with autism spectrum disorder. The children who received ABA in these 11 studies had improved language and behavior. Behaviorism is also applicable to classroom settings, typical classroom settings. Teachers often use rewards such as verbal encouragement and marble jars. Marble jars is when, if they notice that a child is exhibiting a desirable behavior, they'll put a marble in a jar, and when the jar is full, the class will get a reward like a pizza party. Grades are a very widely used reward or punishment for studying and learning the material. Teachers also use punishments such as being sent to the principal's office, suspension, removal of rewards, and also, unfortunately, yelling is also used as a punishment. There are many examples of how behaviorism is used in the classroom, and I've just chosen a few. The examples I've chosen are physical activity for children with ADHD, positive verbal reinforcement for children with emotional disturbance, and a token system for distracted but motivated teens. So, in a research study, Azrin et al. Found that physical activity facilitated improvement in classroom behavior in 2 children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The children were allowed to participate in physical activity when they exhibited focused calmness in the classroom. This resulted in improved behavior, and they were more calm throughout the class. And this is an example of being able to participate in a desired activity if they participate in undesirable activity first. It's the Premack principle. The second study, and it was a case study, Davis et al. Found that positive reinforcement improved behavior in a high school student. The student was having difficulty focusing in class. The researchers provided 2 interventions. The first intervention was self-monitoring, in which the student documented his behavior periodically. He wore a watch that vibrated at 1-minute intervals. The second intervention included self-monitoring plus reinforcement. If the student maintained focus 80% of the time, he would receive a token. He then exchanged 5 tokens for a coffee gift card. Both interventions improved behavior, but the self-monitoring plus reinforcement had the greatest effect. In another research study, Kennedy and Jolivet found that verbal encouragement reduced the time that 2 6th graders with emotional disorders spent outside of the classroom for disruptive behavior. So sending a child out of the classroom for disruptive behavior is a very common practice, especially in special education classrooms. The teachers were asked to add 1 verbal encouragement per 55-minute class period during the first phase of the study. During the second phase of the study, the teachers were asked to add 2 additional verbal encouragements. One of the children decreased her time spent outside of the classroom by approximately 20%. The other child decreased his time spent outside of the classroom by 25%. Positive verbal reinforcement, therefore, improved the children's behavior. So as this research shows, Behaviorism, although it has its limitations, does have a place when educating children and individuals with disabilities. And as long as it's used appropriately, it can be very useful and have very positive outcomes.